Her knees buckle before she feels them give. The ground is cold, a wet April cold that seeps through the thin weave of her stockings and into the bone. She tries to hide the tremor in her legs, but the American guard has already noticed. His flashlight catches the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way the collar of her uniform hangs loose, an inch wider than it was in February. Lice powder still clings to her scalp, chalky, sour, impossible to brush out without water. She stands anyway. Wehrmachthelferinnen, trained to endure. But the faintness comes in waves now, a warning that her body is running on fumes. 1,200 calories became 900, then 600, then whatever crust could be peeled from Kommissbrot without mold. The guard looks her over, chewing slowly on something sweet. The smell is maddening. Vanilla, sugar, warmth. "You're too thin to work," he says. For a moment she expects punishment or a shove toward the labor line. Instead, he tilts his head toward the mess tent, where steam rises in soft white clouds. "Come on," he says. "We'll feed you first." She hesitates. Hunger and humiliation drag against each other inside her ribs. The steam keeps rising. The steam from the American mess tent fades behind her, but the cold stays. It clings in layers: fabric, skin, breath. And this cold is not just weather, it is the residue of collapse. The German supply system had been dying in pieces long before her capture, and her body remembers every stage of that unraveling. She had felt it first in the barracks during the last winter of the war, when the bread rolls shrink to the size of a clenched fist and turn dense as stone. Kommissbrot went from a ration to a relic, something issued only when trains still reached the depots, before rails twisted under bombardment and the last functioning bakeries were overrun by refugees. The Wehrmachthelferinnen, signal auxiliaries, clerks, radio operators, were never fed well to begin with. They lived inside the same starving machine as everyone else, their uniforms tailored to a military collapsing in slow motion, buttons held with mismatched thread, wool becoming thin where elbows rubbed, soap rationed until it became a luxury item traded like currency. By spring 1945, she and thousands like her were not captured as clean uniformed personnel, but as fragments scattered by the front's final convulsions. They walked until boots split. They slept in barns, cellars, drainage ditches. They tried to stay ahead of advancing lines, knowing that capture might mean food, or might mean another kind of waiting, one with no shelter, no structure, no answers. That uncertainty led many to the Rheinwiesenlager, the chain of open-air camps established by the Americans and French along the Rhine. The name would later cause arguments: how severe, how deadly, how chaotic. But for those inside, the memory lived not in debates, but in sensations. Mud that never dried, bare ground instead of barracks, wire without tents, and wind that carried the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies, and above all, the constant grinding emptiness in the stomach. The Americans called the Germans DEFs, disarmed enemy forces, a category created to avoid the legal obligations of the Geneva Convention. To the women, the distinction felt abstract until it didn't, until the first time a guard shrugged and said, "No tents yet," until they realized no Red Cross parcels were coming, until they stood shoulder to shoulder in lines that stretched for hours, waiting for ladles of thin barley broth or canned meat diluted with too much water. She was lucky, or lucky in the sense that history sometimes chooses a softer floor for one person than another. She never entered the worst of the open-air cages. Instead, she wound up in a transit zone designed to funnel female auxiliaries and civilian women through interrogation, sorting, and temporary holding. But transit zones, no matter their intended function, ran on the same raw logistics as the camps around them, and logistics were the first casualties of the Third Reich's collapse. Everything was too few. Too few blankets, too few stoves, too few medics, too few interpreters, too few calories. So the body adapted. It thinned. It cannibalized itself. Menstrual cycles stopped. quietly at first, then with a kind of finality that made young women feel older than they were. Cheeks hollowed, finger joints protruded, hair lost shine, then elasticity, then clumps. For women, hunger lived not just in the stomach, it lived in the reproductive system, the skin, the teeth, the scalp. A woman could track her decline by the feel of her own hair in her hands. Hunger carried smell, too, not the sharp tang of starvation alone, but the scent of unwashed wool, sweat dried into seams, and the faint sour odor of feverish bodies pressed together in lines. Hygiene collapsed faster for women than for men. Men could tear a shirt into rags and call it done. Women needed cloth for menstruation, and cloth required washing, and washing required water, and water meant waiting in lines and exposing yourself to cold winds. Many stopped altogether, creating makeshift pads from anything absorbent. Old field dressings, strips cut from the hems of skirts, bits of packaging, handfuls of moss when despair outweighed shame. And then there were the lice. Kleiderlouse, body lice, tiny creatures that thrived in seams and folds of fabric. You could feel them before you saw them, the subtle needling itch along the waistline, the crawl between shoulder blades, the sensation of being alive with something that wasn't you. Women tried to hide infestations because discovery meant delousing. Powder rubbed into the scalp, the burning smell of crayolin, hair chopped bluntly with shears. Some who had never cut their hair in their lives watched it fall in rough piles at their feet. The humiliation burned deeper than the powder. All of this formed the landscape she carried when the Americans processed her. Not a map of Europe, not a chain of offensives, a geography of the body: hollow stomach, swollen feet, raw skin, lice scars, hunger headaches. These were the coordinates. The American side of this landscape felt almost alien. Trucks arrived with boxes, gray, angular, metallic. Field kitchens unfolded like steel flowers. The Americans had logistics, capital L logistics, the kind measured in thousands of tons, in convoys stretching miles. Even when their camps were overwhelmed, the contrast remained stark. Their uniforms smelled of laundry soap. Their boots held their shape. Their belts, tools, forks, and cups gleamed with a brightness that felt surreal to women accustomed to rust and shortages. Many German women spoke later about the shock of American abundance, even in the camp settings. Not luxury, just abundance. A stack of wooden crates, a full ladle, hot coffee, the smell of fat in the air. To someone eating 600 calories a day, these were miracles. Yet, abundance did not automatically mean safety. The Americans were not prepared for the volume of prisoners, especially women. They had not expected Wehrmachthelferinnen in such numbers: radio operators, clerks, drivers, typists, many of whom looked like civilians at first glance. Sorting them meant interrogations, files, classification, and classification determined rations. Women labeled as non-essential personnel often received less because the camp infrastructure assumed that workers received higher calorie allotments. But starvation made many unfit for work, a paradox that trapped them. Unfit meant less food. Less food meant more unfit. It was during one of these assessments that she heard the sentence that would lodge itself into her bones: "You're too thin to work." Such assessments were clinical in theory, but deeply intimate in practice. A medic, sometimes a doctor in uniform, sometimes a sergeant trained to follow a checklist, pressed fingers into forearms to gauge muscle loss, lifted chins to inspect the sunken pockets below the jaw, checked eyes for dullness, looked at fingernails for break lines. German women, raised in a culture of strict propriety, often froze under the touch. Many had never been examined by a man before. The Americans meant efficiency. The women felt exposure. She remembered standing in line that morning with the others. Wind cut through the loose threads of her tunic. The sun hung high but gave no warmth. A few women fainted and were carried aside, laid on blankets that had been used too many times without washing. A medic checked their pulses with hands that smelled of tobacco and antiseptic. Someone retched, dry heaves from an empty stomach. When her turn came, the medic asked her age, her role, her last meal. She tried to answer calmly, but her voice broke on the word meal. The last real one had been weeks ago. She'd had a crust 2 days earlier, shared with another woman whose ribs looked like the hull of a wrecked boat. The medic gestured for her to extend her arm. His thumb pressed lightly over the radius bone. Too easily, his fingers encircled her wrist. He tilted his head, studying her more closely. "Ma'am, you're too thin to work." He said it as if announcing a simple fact, not a judgment on her survival chances. To her, the words landed like a verdict. Work meant calories. Work meant purpose. Work meant a path out of the limbo that defined DEF status. To be too thin to work was to be useless in a system built on classification. Uselessness felt dangerous. She waited for the next order. Latrine detail, punishment, a move to a lower ration group. The women ahead of her had often received those outcomes. Yet, something different happened. The medic glanced at the guard beside him, a tall American from the South, Texas, maybe Oklahoma, based on the drawl. The guard frowned, then gestured towards the mess tent. "Send her to the kitchen," he said. Not to scrub pots, not to haul water, to eat. The idea seemed impossible. Food was not a gift. It was rationed. It had value, weight, consequence. She hesitated because she knew that receiving food meant standing out. Standing out meant attention. Attention meant risk. But the guard wasn't waiting for her interpretations. He jerked his head again. "Go on. They'll get you started." The phrase, "get you started," could have meant work. Yet as she approached the tent, she smelled it. The unmistakable aroma of something fatty and warm. It made her mouth flood with saliva instantly. Painfully. The body reacts faster than the mind when starved. She stepped inside, and the context of her entire world shifted. Here, the story of the camps begins, not with barbed wire or policy memos or international categories, but with sensation. Heat on the face, steam on the skin, a metal ladle striking the rim of a pot, and the smell of food so rich it felt almost violent after months of deprivation. This was the contrast that defined the American camps in 1945. Deprivation outside, abundance inside, and German bodies caught between the two environments like overloaded circuits. The Americans themselves didn't always understand the impact. To them, a piece of white bread was just bread. To a woman who had never seen such bread in her life, bread that bent instead of crumbling, bread as soft as cake, it was an artifact of another world. But that moment, with the steam curling around her face, belonged to something larger than her alone. It belonged to the material history of surrender, where logistics dictated dignity, where the collapse of one system met the overwhelming force of another. Her story sits here, between those two systems, in the narrow space where hunger meets abundance, and the body remembers both. The body remembers abundance violently. After months of scarcity, even the smell of hot food can feel disorienting. That was the tension pulsing through the American camps in 1945. Bodies conditioned by collapse, meeting a supply system that, despite strain, shortages, and overwhelming numbers, was still functional, still structured, still powerful. Inside the tent, she saw that structure on display, not through speeches or regulations, but through objects. Steel ladles, deep pots, stacks of tin trays, crates marked with stenciled English words, rations, C-type, meat component, biscuits, a whole universe of packaging all foreign to German eyes. Even the waste bins were strange, tall metal cylinders with lids that clapped shut. Nothing like the open wooden crates she had grown used to rifling through for scraps in the final weeks of the war. The Americans ate standing, leaning against tables, laughing through mouthfuls. Their jackets were thick, lined, insulated. She read the insignia without understanding the rank, noticing instead the stitching, the color, the texture. Even fatigue had a different look on them, less hollow, more padded, more alive. This contrast mattered because it anchored the entire post-surrender system. The Americans were fed. The Germans were processed. Processing started with classification, a sorting mechanism that shaped everything that followed. Men were separated by rank, affiliation, and combat status. Women were divided differently, by role, Wehrmachthelferinnen or civilian, by region, by perceived ideological threat, by labor potential, and sometimes simply by what the American officer thought he saw when he looked at them. Their files were thin at first, then thickened rapidly as intelligence teams pushed for details. Unit names, locations, dates, equipment, personnel. Many resented this. They were clerks, typists, radio operators, seen by the Germans as support staff, seen by the Americans as potential communication intelligence sources. Yet despite being valuable on paper, they were fragile in reality. Many arrived at the camps underweight. Others carried infections from weeks on the road. Some had trench foot from walking in soaked boots. Many had lice. And a smaller number, rarely spoken about openly, carried injuries from assaults during the chaotic last weeks of the war, when front lines fractured and authority dissolved. The Americans saw the exterior signs. They did not often see the interior ones. This difference fed into the emerging camp dichotomy, the golden cage versus the mud hell. The golden cage referred to American-run facilities with some shelter, repaired Wehrmacht barracks, requisitioned farms, tent camps with flooring, makeshift kitchens, and medical stations. These sites were still overcrowded, still undersupplied, still tense, but they offered heat, routine, and at least the promise of food. Not enough food, not always regular food, but more than the chaos outside. The women who passed through these camps remembered them as places of contradiction. They were prisoners, yet safer than they had been on the road. They were hungry, yet fed. They were powerless, yet suddenly surrounded by a system that, unlike their collapsing homeland, still functioned. The mud hell meant the Rheinwiesenlager. Bare ground, open sky, no barracks, little water, almost no privacy, just wire and weather and waiting. There, women dug shallow pits with their hands to escape wind. Rain turned the ground into a sucking sludge that clung to skin, hair, and clothing. The mud carried its own smell, earthy, metallic, sour where latrines overflowed. People remembered this not as a detail, but as a defining feature. The mud swallowed bedding, it swallowed shoes, it swallowed dignity. Women who had lived through that often spoke about how their feet changed, swelling, cracking, stiffening, then numbing. Many lost nails. Some developed infections that lingered for years. Frostbite took others, especially during cold nights with no cover. Sleeping on wet soil sucked heat from the body so efficiently that many woke trembling uncontrollably. The water lines were the cruelest. The camp authorities struggled to set up proper distribution. So prisoners queued for hours with helmets, pots, even boots cut open to carry a leader. The time spent waiting meant missing food. The time spent missing food meant missing strength. Missing strength meant collapsing. Collapsing meant losing your place in line all over again. Hunger proved the great equalizer. Generals starved beside privates. Clerks beside cooks. Auxiliaries beside civilians. No rank mattered when the stomach turned on itself. It was during this period that the phrase hunger winter entered the German vocabulary. Technically, it referred to 1946 to 47, when famine conditions hit the civilian population. But the imagery, the cold, the thin rations, the bloated stomachs, the dizziness, already existed in 1945 for anyone behind the wire, especially for women whose bodies reacted faster and more violently to caloric deprivation. Men's rations fluctuated widely, but even the lowest male work groups often received more than women in non-essential categories. The assumption, deeply rooted in military logic, was that men were laborers and women were dependents. Dependents needed less. The result? Rapid, severe weight loss. American medical reports noted that many German women arrived at intake weighing 38 to 45 kilograms. Some fell below that. One report mentions a woman whose body mass was so low that the medic could circle her upper arm with his thumb and a forefinger. Another described advanced amenorrhea, a clinical phrase for starvation-induced loss of menstruation. For the women, these changes were not clinical. They were tactile. The feeling of hip bones against the ground when trying to sleep. The ache in the knees after standing too long. The way breasts flattened, then shrank. The way hair brushed out in clumps. The way breath smelled sweeter, almost fruity, a sign of ketosis. Hunger sharpened senses, but dulled judgment. Women later described forgetting words, forgetting names, forgetting parts of themselves. One woman wrote that she walked in circles for an entire afternoon because she couldn't remember where the water point was, though it was only 200 meters away. It was into this world, this mix of chaos and structure, that the Americans introduced their own logic. They wanted order. They wanted efficiency. They wanted intel. They wanted to stabilize a continent teetering on famine. The problem was that German women arrived in a state that defied order. They arrived with lice, with infections, with menstrual emergencies, with frostbite damage, with clothes that had not dried in weeks, with bodies that had stopped functioning normally. American supply officers faced an impossible equation: finite rations, infinite need. The U.S. Army was already feeding millions: troops, prisoners, displaced persons, civilians in devastated cities. Every extra spoon of beans to a prisoner was one less for someone else in the supply chain. Yet the Americans had something Germany no longer possessed: infrastructure, warehouses, convoys, meal plans, calorie charts, medical protocols. That infrastructure made moments like the one she had just experienced possible. A medic could identify starvation and redirect her to food. A cook could scoop an extra ladle. A guard could decide that compassion outweighed regulation. For a moment, at least. But such moments were not guaranteed. They depended on personalities, not policies. Some guards enforced strict rations. Some mocked the starving women. Some ignored fainting prisoners. Some looked away from suffering. Others, quietly, pragmatically, helped. The dichotomy created a strange emotional landscape for the prisoners. They never knew which face of the American system they would encounter on a given day: the efficient machine or the indifferent one, the humane individual or the overwhelmed camp. This emotional instability fed into a psychological one. The women were caught between relief at survival and shame at dependence. Germans were raised on cultural notions of discipline, cleanliness, and self-reliance. To stand in line for foreign food felt like losing something fundamental. To be examined by American men felt like exposure. To be told they were too thin to work felt like a verdict on their worth. Such tensions simmered beneath every interaction. The body was the battlefield now, and the body was losing. Meanwhile, beyond the camp fences, the wider world was collapsing into scarcity. German civilians dug for potatoes in frozen fields, broke apart fences for firewood, traded wedding rings for flour. Cities lay in ruins. Rail lines were wrecked. Supply chains were shattered. The hunger winter of 1946 to 1947 would later be remembered as a national trauma. But its early currents ran directly through these camps, through these women, through these days of processing and waiting. That is why the moment in the mess tent mattered. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was rare, but because it revealed something essential. The scale of contrast between a body shaped by collapse and a system that still had the power to feed. She stepped deeper into the tent, into the steam, into the warmth. Her legs trembled, her stomach cramped sharply, anticipation mixed with fear of what real food might do to her. Outside, the camp stretched in rows of tents, fences, and ration queues. Inside, a ladle rose. Metal struck metal. A voice said, "Next." And this is where the microhistory begins in earnest, with the collision of hunger and abundance, of fragility and procedure, of bodies and systems. Hygiene crisis and material shock. The first thing the women noticed was the smell. Not the food this time, but the antiseptic, a sharp chemical tang that lingered in the air like a promise of relief and a reminder of violation. Lice powder, creolin, disinfectant, these were the daily perfumes of a body under scrutiny. The Americans had tents set aside for delousing, small rooms where women were gathered in batches. Each woman was instructed to remove layers of clothing and submit to inspection. Hair was parted, fingers pressed against scalp, combs run through tangles that had grown dense with months of neglect. Shaves were ordered if lice were found. The scissors cut coarse strands, leaving scalps raw, sensitive to the cold and the wind. For many, this was the first time they had touched their hair without fear or exhaustion. Yet it hurt. The raw skin burned when powder was applied. A faint chemical cloud choked the lungs, making the body flinch instinctively. The mind understood the necessity. The body registered shame, pain, and relief all at once. Menstruation became a different kind of battle. Supplies were non-existent. Women improvised. They tore old uniforms, cut rags from skirts, collected cotton when they could barter it from other prisoners, or even from sympathetic GIs. Some collected moss or dried grass from outside the fences, patting and folding it into makeshift paths. The friction of damp cloth against the skin, the constant itch of lice, and the pressure of trying to hide one's body from both inspection and shame created a state of perpetual vigilance. Sleep became impossible for some, even on borrowed blankets, because the body never relaxed. It was a battlefield, cold, itchy, damp, hungry, exposed. This was compounded by the Kleiderläuse, the body lice that thrived in seams and folds of worn clothing. They were invisible until movement stirred them, a crawling itch along the spine or waistline, the sharp sting of their bites leaving tiny red tracks. Scratching was mandatory relief, yet dangerous because the skin tore easily from malnutrition. Some women scratched until they drew blood, then rubbed antiseptic into the wounds, which only burned more fiercely. Hair, skin, bones, every surface of the body became a canvas of suffering and endurance. It was a constant negotiation with the self. Do I scratch and bleed, or do I endure an ache? Every decision was somatic, immediate, unavoidable. Beyond hygiene, material shock awaited those women who had somehow survived the collapse of the Reich, only to confront the American supply machine. The first taste of white bread was a moment of disbelief. To a German woman used to Kommissbrot, dense, dark, sour, sometimes moldy, white bread felt like cake. Soft, airy, almost sweet. Her teeth sank into it, and she thought she might faint from the contradiction between memory and present sensation. Every bite carried warmth and weight she had not felt in months. The stomach churned, unsure how to process something so alien. Some vomited from the shock of richness. Others cried silently, shivering in cold uniform jackets, realizing they could eat without calculation. Nylon stockings presented another type of sensory dissonance. Thin, smooth, shimmering in the tent light, they felt like silk against calloused skin. Women ran their fingers along the seams, marveling at the texture, the elasticity, the impossibility of such an object existing in their world. Clothing, previously utilitarian, had now become almost magical. The Americans handed out surplus items, blankets, socks, jackets. Every item had a weight and smell and feel that registered in memory. The scent of freshly laundered wool, the crispness of cotton sheets, the faint tang of American soap. Improvisation remained essential even amid abundance. The bucket trick became a survival tool. Women filled tin or enameled buckets with hot water whenever possible, using them to wash clothing or patch wounds. They learned quickly how to balance heat and volume to make a bath with a single liter last for multiple people. Water became sacred, soap rarer than bread, and each bath required delicate negotiation with other women and the guards. The body remembered the ritual, pouring hot water over the shoulders, wringing ragged fabric, the scent of soap against hair and skin, and the momentary relief when warmth replaced the months of cold. These micro-historical details, lice, menstruation, shaved heads, white bread, nylon stockings, the bucket, were not mere anecdotes. They were the physical proof of collapse meeting external order, of deprivation meeting abundance, of survival negotiating with dignity. Every sensory encounter left an imprint, the itching, the burning, the softness, the richness. The body was the archive, and every woman carried it. The paradox was immediate. Women learned to fear touch, yet crave it. They learned that abundance could harm as well as heal. Too much, too fast, and the stomach rebelled. Too much novelty, and the mind registered disbelief. But the material culture of the Americans, rations, clothing, soap, utensils, became the medium through which bodies began to recover. Slowly. Fragile, uneven, but recover nonetheless. Fraternization and survival exchange. Bodies that had spent months learning to survive without comfort suddenly confronted tactile opportunity and danger. The Americans carried warmth in their hands and confidence in their gestures. For women starved, frostbitten, lice-ridden, the contrast between deprivation and touch was immediate and bewildering. A handshake, a brief touch on the arm, the sharing of a spoon, a brush of hair, all of it registered on nerves honed by months of vigilance and pain. The body remembered every sensation. Every contact was a negotiation between trust and fear. Fraternization, the military term, existed in theory as a strict ban. The U.S. Army regulations forbade sexual relations with prisoners. In practice, however, proximity, hunger, and survival needs created an impossible gray zone. Women colloquially referred to as chocolate girls, named for the chocolate bars sometimes offered as bribes or gifts, were caught in this paradox. Accepting chocolate, cigarettes, or small gifts could be a strategy to secure extra rations or warmth. Decline could mean starvation, exclusion from soup lines, or isolation during work details. The body had learned calculation. Which hands could be trusted, which smiles meant generosity, which presence carried danger. The sensory register was central. Chocolate, sweet, rich, heavy, melted slowly against parched tongues, releasing sugar that the body had gone months without. A cigarette, its bitter aroma and warmth could temporarily mask hunger or cold. Small touches lingered longer than the gifts themselves. A soldier brushing a sleeve against an arm or holding a ladle steady while guiding a prisoner's hand created friction between fear, gratitude, and bodily memory. Every gesture became an event, recorded in the body as much as in memory. Survival sex, when it occurred, was not often a choice made in pleasure. It was bargaining with the body, leveraging what remained of health, youth, or feminine presentation to secure warmth, food, or protection. Hair brushed smooth, skirts arranged to cover or reveal, glances exchanged across mess lines. Each small movement carried purpose. These interactions were intensely sensory. Skin pressed against skin, the metallic scent of the mess tent, the warmth of a coat held open, the rhythm of a heartbeat beneath uniform, and the smell of sweat. These were the metrics of survival. Women later described compartmentalizing shame, distancing the mind from sensation to endure. Their bodies, though, remembered every contour, pressure, and taste. Even small exchanges carried weight. A spoon of soup offered directly by a soldier, the warmth of his jacket shared over trembling shoulders, the hand that guided hers to the water point. These acts, legal, practical, moral, were deeply intimate. They were lessons in trust and betrayal, in the collapse of social norms, and in the tactile negotiation required to survive. The paradox created psychological tension. Women trained in discipline and propriety were now measured against their bodily needs. Hunger dictated action, not ideology. Lice and cold dictated adaptation, not moral code. Yet, social judgment persisted within the prisoner groups. Gossip circulated swiftly. Who accepted chocolate? Who traded favors? Who negotiated warmth? Compliance could bring survival, but ostracism followed exposure. The body became the site of both diplomacy and exploitation, registering each minor victory or failure. Objects mediated these interactions. A chocolate bar, a scrap of nylon, a tin cup of soup all became currencies. The taste, the weight, the texture mattered. Women remembered the crispness of American bread, the melt of chocolate on the tongue, the heat radiating from a coat sleeve as vividly as any conversation or document. Hunger sharpened these impressions. Cold intensified them. Fatigue rendered them unforgettable. The microhistory of these moments is critical. It was not a story of romance, nor of grand morality, nor of political intrigue. It was a story of bodies negotiating survival, sensation, and scarcity. Every sensation, hot, sweet, sticky, soft, abrasive, was cataloged in the nervous system, later emerging in memoirs and interviews as both trauma and fascination. Women recalled the tension in the mess tent, the hesitation at the chocolate exchange, the uneasy relief of warmth, and the sting of shame. These were the true records of occupation, written on flesh and bone. Even the ban itself was somatic. Guards enforced it inconsistently, creating microenvironments where proximity could mean safety or danger. The women learned to read the subtle cues of compliance and threat, the tilt of a head, the twitch of an eye, the steadiness of a hand. Their bodies, so thin and vulnerable, became instruments of perception, balancing every potential touch against months of deprivation. In this space, the line between necessity and intimacy blurred. Ration lines, delousing tents, mess halls, all became stages where survival required engagement with the American body. Hunger dictated compliance. Exposure dictated caution. Yet these encounters also delivered small, almost imperceptible gifts: warmth, flavor, touch, even a measure of human recognition. Bodies remembered gratitude as vividly as humiliation, comfort as sharply as fear. This was the paradox. Fraternization was both violation and salvation, shame and necessity, risk and relief. The women navigated it daily, often without conscious thought. Their muscles remembered the pressure of hands, their skin the heat of a coat, their tongues the sweetness of chocolate, their nerves the ache of unanticipated touch. Each sensory detail became an archive of survival, a map of a human body in extremis. The line moved slowly. Her legs trembled not from weakness alone, but from anticipation. Each step carried the memory of mud, frostbite, and hunger. The American tent loomed ahead, canvas taut against the wind, and its interior glowing with lantern light. Inside, a medic waited with instruments, clipboards, and a calm efficiency that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. The smell of antiseptic and boiled meat mingled in the air, making her stomach twist unpredictably. When her turn came, the medic beckoned with a gloved hand. She stepped forward, and the cold metal of the stethoscope pressed against her chest. The contact was instant, intimate, invasive, and entirely clinical. Her ribs pressed against thin fabric, hollow yet sensitive to every touch. She drew in a shivering breath. The air inside the tent smelled of metal, soap, and something faintly sweet, spilled sugar from the cook's prep. The body reacted faster than the mind. Muscles tightened, stomach clenched, pulse jumped. "Name?" the medic asked. She answered, voice brittle, eyes downcast. The tilt of her neck exposed the thin skin of her neck. Fingers ran over her collarbone, tracing the hollow where muscle should have been. Every inch of her body seemed magnified under scrutiny. The medic's hands were professional, but for a body that had not been touched with care for weeks, they were almost violent in their precision. The assessment continued. Weight measured, skin checked, eyes inspected for dullness, nails studied for break lines. Each detail registered like a judgment. Then the words she had heard before echoed once again, but with a sharper edge. "You're too thin to work." Her stomach clenched. The sentence was a verdict, a measure of her bodily worth in the New World Order. Work equaled calories, calories equaled survival. To be unfit meant exposure, weakness, visibility. Yet before she could process despair, the medic gestured toward the mess tent, toward warmth, toward something the body could understand: sustenance. The white bread shock came in stages. She had seen the loaves stacked in neat piles. They gleamed under lantern light, soft and pale. She picked up a slice. Her fingers sank slightly into the spongy surface. The texture was unfamiliar, light, pliable, almost sweet. She raised it to her mouth, heart pounding, stomach aching from emptiness. The first bite surprised her. The soft crumb yielded easily, the crust crisp but tender. A warmth spread through her jaw, a flood of moisture to her parched tongue. Her stomach convulsed, not in pain, not in hunger alone, but in disbelief. The body's memory of deprivation clashed violently with this sudden abundance. Tears stung her eyes, unbidden, as if her body could not reconcile the sensation of nourishment with months of absence. She chewed slowly, tasting wheat without grit, sugar without compromise. Each bite forced her to remember every thin crust she had scavenged, every bitter barley mash she had endured. Each bite was both reward and accusation. Nearby, an American soldier, tall, sleeves rolled, a faint smell of tobacco and cooking fat, watched with quiet detachment. But when he noticed her trembling hands, he did something small yet profound. He offered the bread directly. lifting a piece toward her mouth. The gesture was casual, but for her it carried gravity, the heat radiating from his palm, the slight pressure of his fingertips against hers, the steadiness of his arm. Each nuance registered on nerves long accustomed to fear and vigilance. The body responded before the mind. She took the bread. Her teeth sank in. Warmth, softness, flavor. The human body was remembering what it had lost. Hunger receded, not linearly, but in shocks, every bite sending pulses through muscles and organs that had been silent for weeks. The digestive system awoke with a start, sending tremors through stomach, chest, and limbs. She felt alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. And yet, the friction remained. Every act of nourishment was tinged with vulnerability. Acceptance of the bread meant exposure, dependence, acknowledgement of the imbalance of power. Every sensory detail, the weight of the slice, the subtle scent of baked wheat, the warmth of the soldier's hand, was now inseparable from survival. Her body cataloged each element with precision: chew, swallow, heat, taste, and smell. The mind tried to follow, tried to separate shame from relief, yet the nerves recorded it all without judgment. The medic moved on, summoning the next prisoner. She remained rooted, savoring the taste, absorbing the heat, registering every touch, sound, and aroma. Around her, other women experienced their own micro-traumas and micro-pleasures. The line was both ritual and limbo, a place where human friction, the collision of hunger, exposure, and the possibility of kindness, played out in small, sensory episodes. Outside, the wind howled through the open camp. The mud had frozen in patches. The smell of smoke from makeshift fires blended with the distant odor of feces, wet wool, and dying heat. Inside the tent, however, warmth, nourishment, and human contact created a bubble where the body could finally register relief, shock, and adaptation simultaneously. This was the moment of turning, when abundance confronted deprivation, when the body, long trained in survival, began to relearn sensation. Hunger became awareness, exposure became negotiation, and the simple act of eating became a profound interface between conqueror and captured, between past trauma and immediate survival. The sensory imprint of that first bite of white bread, the softness, warmth, and sweetness, would linger for decades, becoming the axis around which memory, trauma, and gratitude rotated. It was the first human friction of a larger story, a narrative of survival where bodies remembered more than minds, where the collapse of one system collided with the meticulous order of another, and where touch, taste, and heat marked the first step toward recovery. The next encounter came unexpectedly. A child, small and pale, with arms trembling from cold, stood beside the mess tent. The woman instinctively moved closer, though the line pressed from behind. A soldier knelt, hands steady, and handed the child a tin of condensed milk. She saw the child's lips part, tongue touching the thick sweetness. The sound was almost inaudible, the faint gulp, a soft exhale of relief. But to her, it was seismic. Her body reacted before she thought. The tightness in her chest eased slightly, warmth spreading from her shoulders down her limbs. Hunger, fatigue, and fear had made every interaction a negotiation. Yet here was generosity in its purest form. The warmth of the metal tin, the smooth thickness of the milk, the faint sweetness, all registered as human friction and human grace simultaneously. She reached out instinctively, touching the child's arm to steady him, her fingers cold, trembling, almost invisible against the thin sleeve. The soldier's eyes met hers briefly, no words exchanged, and she felt the unspoken acknowledgement that survival sometimes demanded connection, sometimes demanded surrender. Other women watched from the line. Some judged, some envied, some took the lesson to heart. Proximity to kindness could be a survival tool. Each interaction became somatic instruction, Touch, warmth, nourishment, and attention were currencies as potent as any ration card. Their bodies cataloged these gestures with the precision of months-long hunger. The pressure of hands, the texture of food, the heat of a coat, the scent of soap, the timbre of a voice. Then came the medical inspection that felt more like violation. Women were instructed to remove clothing, bend, squat, open mouths, lift arms. The medic's hands were professional, but unavoidable in their intimacy. She shivered, not from cold alone, but from exposure. Every nerve ending was hyper-aware. The eyes of other women, the glances of soldiers, the subtle hum of the lantern, all created a charged sensory environment. The body remembered everything. The metallic taste of fear, the burn of cold air against skin, the ache of bones beneath thin fabric, the soft pressure of gloves against shoulders. Some women resisted internally, stiffening their muscles, averting gaze, turning their bodies into shields. Others surrendered to the necessity, letting the touch guide them toward rations, warmth, or protection. The tent became a locus of negotiation, where power, survival, and sensation collided. Lice powder, bandages, warmth, and food were the prizes, but they required submission, exposure, and constant somatic vigilance. The white bread shock continued in subtle ways. After the initial taste, she found herself oscillating between fear and delight, stomach spasming from overreaction, hands trembling from sudden fullness. Her body, trained in months of scarcity, could not yet process abundance smoothly. Every bite sent pulses through stomach, chest, and limbs, reverberating memories of thin crusts scavenged from mud, bitter barley meals, and endless waits for ration lines. The body cataloged these contrasts: the soft crumb against calloused fingers, the warmth on the tongue, the tension in the jaw muscles, the ache in the ribs as fullness returned. Survival demanded attention to small gestures. A soldier offering an extra slice, a ladle of soup poured directly, a blanket draped over shoulders. These became micro moments of trust and power. Each touch was measured. Could it be relied upon? Was it a prelude to violation or simple compassion? Every body had learned vigilance, yet every body craved warmth and sustenance. Hunger, cold, and exposure sharpened these contradictions. The sensory archive expanded rapidly. The smell of freshly baked bread, mingled with antiseptic and the faint tang of human sweat, the touch of fabric against sensitive skin, the warmth of hands, coats, and heated tins, the taste of condensed milk, chocolate, or thin stew, the echo of boots on frozen ground. All of it became the language of survival, replacing ideology with immediacy, theory with sensation. The friction between trust and fear, violation and aid, hunger and satisfaction reached a subtle climax when the line shuffled toward exit. Women carried rations, blankets, and sometimes chocolate in pockets, cradled like precious cargo. Their bodies ached, trembled, and throbbed with sensations newly remembered. Pain, cold, and hunger had not disappeared, but abundance had inscribed new patterns. Trust, cautiously extended; warmth, reluctantly accepted; nourishment, cautiously internalized. The body remained the archive, insistent and unforgiving. Memory encoded every micro-interaction: the press of a hand, the scrape of scissors against hair, the warmth of a bread slice, the sweetness of chocolate, the smell of smoke and antiseptic mingled with human sweat. These somatic traces, often unnoticed at the time, would outlast the paperwork, the regulations, the announcements, and the ideological constructs of occupation. For that woman, and for many others, the camp tent and its line were not just a place of processing, but a crucible. Hunger and cold sculpted bodies into instruments of survival. Touch and warmth taught lessons about trust and vulnerability. Food, clothing, and simple gestures became intimate data points in a larger story of recovery, negotiation, and human friction. The tent emptied slowly. The line dissolved. Women retreated to blankets, to whispered exchanges, to quiet moments of sensory reflection. The Americans moved to other tasks, oblivious to the depth of imprint left behind. Outside, wind scoured the camp, mud remained frozen in ridges, and the world waited with the same indifferent patience it had shown all along. Inside, bodies remembered heat, touch, taste, and the fragile, trembling arc of survival. Somatic legacy and early recovery. Months of deprivation left bodies thin, fragile, and hypersensitive. Even after rations and warmth became available, the physical memory of hunger persisted. Muscles that had atrophied from lack of work and constant fatigue trembled involuntarily. Bones jutted sharply under pale skin, and even minor exertion caused breath to hitch in the chest. Hands, once nimble, shook as they lifted bowls, tore rations, or attempted to mend tattered clothing. Every movement required calculation. How much energy could be spent, how quickly would the stomach protest, and how would the heart respond? Skin bore the evidence of months spent in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Lice bites had left raised red streaks, some forming scabs that peeled when scratched. Even after delousing and antiseptic baths, the itch persisted as a phantom memory, causing fingers to scratch absent-mindedly at arms or necks. Hair, once a source of pride, had been shorn or fell in patches from neglect. Scalp scars burned in cold air, sunlight felt abrasive against exposed skin. For many women, hair regrowth was slow, uneven, and accompanied by the constant itch of lingering nits or sensitivity from chemical treatments. The digestive system struggled to reconcile months of meager, coarse food with sudden abundance. The first real meal could trigger nausea, cramping, or diarrhea. Stomachs, unaccustomed to fat and sugar, reacted violently. Some women learned to eat small, careful portions, tasting each morsel, and gauging the body's reaction. Others experienced the euphoria of fullness, but paid the price in digestive spasms or bloating. Calorie counts became visceral rather than numerical. 1,200 calories a day felt luxurious. 2,000 a challenge. The nervous system learned to associate both hunger and satiety with intense bodily sensation. Immune systems, compromised by months of undernourishment and exposure, struggled against infection. Minor scratches or abrasions became entry points for bacteria. Cold, damp clothing, mud, and crowded sleeping areas encouraged respiratory illnesses. Fever, chills, and weakness persisted long after formal treatment. Pain became a chronic companion. Joints ached from vitamin deficiency, fingers cracked, and teeth hurt from lack of calcium. The body bore the weight of systemic neglect in ways that would take years to fully resolve. Psychologically, the women experienced a somatic echo of trauma. Shivering at cold drafts, flinching at sudden touches, stomach tightening at the smell of food or the sound of footsteps, these were the body's residual warnings. Sleep often came in bursts, fragmented by nightmares of hunger or exposure. Muscle tension remained constant, a physical memory of vigilance and fear. Even when food, warmth, and safety were secured, the body retained a muscular and neural archive of the deprivation endured. Memoirs and oral histories later confirmed these somatic realities. In A Woman in Berlin and Other Testimonies, former Wehrmachthelferinnen described aching bones, persistent hair loss, stomach sensitivity, and skin hypersensitivity years after liberation. Medical records from U.S. camps indicated that even with 2,000 to 2,500 calorie rations, recovery was slow. Weight gain came in fits. Energy returned unevenly. Women who had endured frostbite often retained cold-sensitive extremities. Those with chronic lice infestations developed lasting skin irritation. Their bodies carried the record of trauma long after paperwork declared them recovered. This slow reawakening of the body, muscles regaining tone, digestive systems recalibrating, hair regrowing, skin healing, marked the first stage of true post-war survival. Yet beneath this fragile progress lay the persistent imprint of deprivation, a nervous system tuned to scarcity, a body calibrated to extreme vigilance, a sensory archive that recorded the smallest gestures of both kindness and cruelty. In this way, the aftermath was not simply the end of hunger. It was a delicate negotiation between body memory and new environment, a recalibration of touch, taste, warmth, and movement. Survival had become embodied. Recovery would demand both patience and adaptation. Enduring consequences and somatic memory. Years after liberation, the women carried the physical legacy of their captivity. Bones remained fragile, joints ached, and hands were prone to tremors. For some, malnutrition had caused stunted growth or infertility, consequences only realized in adulthood. Calorie deprivation of 1,000 to 2,500 calories a day for months had lasting impact, muscle wastage, organ strain, and metabolic slowdown. Even with post-war rations of 2,000 to 2,500 calories, the body struggled to restore equilibrium. Fatigue lingered, a persistent echo of previous hunger. Hair regrowth, for many, became a visible marker of trauma. Women whose heads had been shorn due to lice infestations reported patchy, slow-returning hair, sometimes brittle and prone to breakage. Scalp sensitivity remained. The memory of chemical powders and sharp scissors made combing or washing a ritual fraught with subtle anxiety. Skin, too, retained the textural memory of deprivation, dryness, rough patches, and persistent itching long after lice were eradicated. The epidermis itself became a living archive of months spent in crowded, unsanitary quarters. The digestive system often carried the most immediate somatic memory. Sudden indulgence in rich food could trigger nausea or cramping. A slice of white bread, chocolate, or fatty stew might evoke both pleasure and physical discomfort. The nervous system, trained to scarcity, responded to excess with signals of warning. Stomach spasms, accelerated heartbeat, and short-lived vertigo. These reactions were frequently documented in oral histories and camp medical reports, noting that former prisoners often required months of careful dietary reintroduction to regain functional digestion. Psychologically, trauma was inseparable from the somatic. Shivering at cold drafts, muscle tension when startled, and nightmares recalling the hunger, exposure, and inspection lines were all physical responses. Memoirs repeatedly highlight hypervigilance. Every knock at a door, every sudden touch, every unfamiliar scent could trigger bodily tension. Touch, warmth, and food remained highly charged stimuli, evoking relief and anxiety simultaneously. The body had become a living archive of captivity, storing memory in muscles, nerves, and skin as vividly as any written record. American intervention, however, left complex marks. Gestures of care and minor kindness, a slice of bread, a chocolate bar, or a shared coat formed lasting somatic imprints. Women remembered the warmth of hands, the texture of food, the smell of clean blankets, and the taste of fat and sugar after months of deprivation. These sensory memories often mingled with guilt or shame, as receiving help was entangled with power imbalance, exposure, and survival negotiation. The paradox of gratitude intertwined with trauma created a lasting imprint on how the body processed human contact. Statistics revealed the scope of the experience. The Rheinwiesenlager held over 1 million German prisoners in the immediate post-war months. Reports indicate that caloric intake averaged only 1,100 to 1,200 calories per day initially, rising gradually as aid improved. Medical inspections showed anemia, hypothermia, and skin lesions were pervasive, while infections from lice and frostbite were common. By the time women were released into U.S.-administered care facilities, weight gain was often slow and energy levels remained low. Long-term health effects persisted for years, documented in post-war German medical surveys. Oral histories and memoirs, such as A Woman in Berlin, provide the most intimate record of these somatic consequences. Women recalled trembling hands when holding utensils, the awkwardness of rebuilding digestive tolerance, the lingering phantom itch of lice, and the slow, uneven regrowth of hair. Even decades later, these physical memories persisted as subtle aches, tensions, or involuntary reactions, a testament to how extreme deprivation inscribes itself permanently on the body. The aftermath, therefore, was more than recovery from hunger. It was the body recalibrating to abundance, the nervous system learning safety anew, and the senses absorbing both generosity and threat. Each woman became a living record of human fragility and endurance, her body a repository for the tactile, gustatory, olfactory, and thermal data of survival. The lingering effects, skin sensitivity, digestive fragility, muscle weakness, and nervous hyperalertness, were tangible reminders that trauma is not only psychological or historical, it is physiological, lived, and persistent. Even when ration lines ended, camps closed, and freedom returned, the body retained its archive. The scars were subtle. A shivering hand, a slight wince at cold wind, a sudden stomach spasm at richness. These were the indelible traces of somatic history, silently documenting the intersections of deprivation, survival, kindness, and coercion. Liberation did not erase them. It merely added a new layer, a soft, tenuous envelope of warmth, nourishment, and cautious recovery. The archive of the body. History often speaks in maps, dates, and treaties. Yet for these women, history spoke through the body. A shivering hand, a trembling leg, the slow regrowth of hair, the memory of sweetness on a parched tongue. The war's aftermath was encoded not in dispatches or reports, but in muscle tension, digestive reactions, skin sensitivity, and the subtle calculus of touch. Their bodies remembered hunger, cold, lice, and the rare warmth of human kindness long after the paperwork said they were liberated. The somatic archive challenges the conventional narrative of victory and defeat. It preserves the shock of the mundane, the weight of a tin cup, the texture of komisbrot, the warmth of a coat draped over frozen shoulders. These traces tell us more about survival than medals, flags, or official records. Each bite of white bread, each hesitant touch from a soldier, each moment of exposure or relief was recorded in nerve endings and muscle memory, forming a history that is lived, not summarized. The paradox of post-war existence, abundance juxtaposed with trauma, generosity shadowed by power imbalance, illustrates that liberation was rarely absolute. Survival was negotiated constantly in whispers, glances, and gestures, not in proclamations. The body learned trust cautiously, relearned hunger and satiety, and cataloged the micro-violations and micro-graces that defined everyday life in camps and occupation zones. Looking back, the story of these women reminds us that small interactions matter, that the tactile and sensory experience of history can be as consequential as the political or military narrative. The body becomes a witness where words fail. It carries memory that transcends ideology, geography, or time, embedding human experience into skin, muscle, and nerve. In the quiet decades after the war, these women's bodies spoke truths that no official report could capture. They bore the lasting imprint of deprivation, exposure, and unexpected kindness. And in that archive, The ache, the tremble, the taste, the warmth. History is preserved in its most intimate form. To understand the war fully, we must read not only the documents, but the bodies that endured it, whose flesh still remember what the mind can scarcely recount.